Hello, again we are going to talk about consumer behavior and marginal utilities in our course Engineering Economics INEN 2373. Well, we have seen that we can predict the behavior of the consumer and how the consumer typically allocates in a rational way its resources by making use of the concept of the marginal utility and the marginal utility per dollar spent. So we have used this table. If you have not seen this table before, please make sure that you see the previous video, video number 1 on the topic. If we create a table, a graph using this table, the graph will look like this. And here what we have in the top graphs is the total utility for both food and beverages, and as you can see, the total utility is not ever increasing, but it starts to decrease after a while if we keep consuming. And since the marginal utility becomes similar to a derivative with respect to that function for the total utility, if we have the graph based on the number of units consumed, we will see a decreasing function that eventually reaches 0, at least in the case of the marginal utility for food. Also, we have discussed that the consumer will allocate its resources in such a way that it tries to equally distribute the marginal utility per dollar or per price among all the different satisfactors that they could have. In other words, when we were looking at this graph, and if we were to spend $10, we would have 4 units of food and 3 units of beverages, because the marginal utility per dollar invested or per dollar spent both equal 8. And we have explained how that works in the previous video. So the logic for the consumer is to equalize the marginal utility per dollar of all the goods and services. So consciously or unconsciously, when we assume that the consumer acts rationally, the diversity of products to be consumed have to enter this equation. So when we compare the need to go on vacations with the need of the size of the apartment that we live in, our need for education, and other goods like that, or in items that are more everyday buyings like groceries and movie tickets and so on, each one of us has a particular utility function, that is what gives us the most satisfaction, and based on this and the price that each one of the satisfactor has, we would prefer one item to the other in such a way that, in order to maximize our level of satisfaction, we will try to equalize the marginal utility per price of all our purchases. Also very important is the graph that is depicted here. We call this a demand graph, although actually what it's being graph is a marginal utility. And I'm using the conventions in the textbook, and we have here the quantity in the horizontal axis, and that's the quantity, how many units are traded in the market. And on the vertical axis, what we have is the marginal utility, that is the benefit that the consumer has per buying that number of items. And the theory in economics would say that we're willing to pay a price that gives us some benefit. That is, if the amount of marginal utility of consuming that many goods still exceeds the price that we need to pay to receive those goods, then we will buy that quantity. Let me try to rephrase that. Imagine, if you will, that say you're very thirsty and maybe you're willing to pay a lot of money for the first bottle of soft drink that you might get because you're very thirsty. However, you don't need to pay that much because the prices are down here. Then that means that probably you would be interested in paying more if you still remain thirsty, because you still perceive a benefit of getting more of the same product, and therefore the amount of benefit that you have keeps increasing by comparing the current price that you have with the amount of benefit that you will receive. And you will keep adding more and more units to the purchase for the number of purchased items until you find a point in which if you keep buying more of that, you're not going to get more benefit than the price that you're paying. Because if this is the dollars per unit that you're having to trade at, that is the price, you're going to be willing to buy only these many units. After that point, you are paying a price that is higher than what the perceived value is for you, because you no longer need that much of the same item. So the benefit for the consumer is this triangle here, the shaded area, and that shaded area is of course what is the total amount of the benefit for the consumer. The transaction cost, the total transaction, is the number of units times the price. So the rectangle area that is enclosed by these two extremes and the origin would represent the transaction area, and the consumer surplus or exists there to make us, or to help us make the decision should we keep buying or not. It is really not accounted in any of our accounting systems or official accounting systems, because pretty much what we account for the size of the economy is the size of the transaction or the aggregation of the transactions that we have. That is all these rectangles. But how large is the shaded area, the consumer surplus, on the other hand, is a reflection of how satisfied the society or each one of the consumer is by acquiring this set of products at this particular price. As you can see, this diagonal line is exactly a marginal utility, in the sense that the more that we consume, the less value we perceive in the consumption of that item. In other words, if we're thirsty, we are giving a high value to the very first cup or glass of water that we drink. But if we have consumed so many glasses of water, so many bottles of water, after a while we do not perceive any additional value, and we simply would have to stop. However, in the case of economic transactions, there is a price that we need to pay, and that helps us to determine the level of consumption if we know the current price.